الو. ايه. فكرت رح تطلعينا على السد فوق، طلع في.
Hello.
حلو.
Should we hold it like this, right?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Sunila?
I'm good. How's your gender today?
It's hurting me. Are you?
Ouch.
I'm gonna introduce Sunil to you as a just to do things differently because normally everybody introduce themselves. I'm gonna see what I can remember off the top of my head of Sunila.
That's a good game.
Right? Sunila is a very brilliant Arabist. She has a PhD in Arabic literature from New York University. Sunila has also lived in the Middle East a lot, in Lebanon and Cairo and Syria
And
and
Palestine.
Palestine. And Sunila is a very brilliant translator, both into Arabic and into English. Um, within particular interest in Iraqi poetry of Saliq, right?
Yes.
And she writes very beautifully about gender and transitioning and all that involves linguistically. And you are 36 years old.
Oh, thanks for making me younger by a year.
39?
7.
37. Okay. Did I do a good job?
Mm.
Sunila is half Indian and half American. And what else did I?
Okay, enough for
Yeah.
now.
Okay.
Okay.
Where should we look, by the way? نطلع لوين؟ إيه.
Raphael is one of the first um, trans friends that I had in the Arab world. Um, when I met you, you identified as bigendered, which I still like feel like I connect that to you. Um,
Some days are more
some
by gender than
yeah, yeah.
others.
How's your bigenderality today?
How are your genders
How
today?
is your
Yeah.
Are you bi or pan today?
Am I bi or pan? Oh,
Different kind of bi pride.
it's true.
But Raphael, I remember coming. Um, I think. I mean, I think of you as one of the sort of. Uh, I don't want to say elders, but I would like to say of expressing trans Arab identity.
المخضرمين.
Mukhadrameen. Of course, Mukhadrameen is a great term. It denotes those people who sort of straddled the before pre-Islamic era and the Islamic era and kind of lived through both and had so uh, you lived through the era when uh, there was don't say gay way back and there was no internet, which I barely remember. Um,
تنذكر ما تنعاد.
تنذكر ما تنعاد عن جد. Although sometimes with social media you wish that there was no internet again.
Yeah, it's true.
Um, I remember when Facebook was a dating site and it was the Facebook.
I remember MySpace.
I remember my.
Live Journal, but
I had a live journal.
really? Is it still
Yes.
there?
I don't know. But
Let's
some
find
people,
out.
and
Who
there was
has
Friendster also. Do you
Yeah.
remember Friendster?
Friendster, I didn't get very
It was
involved
a
in
early social
okay.
media in the early 2000s.
I remember I was dating somebody in the 90s, and she had email. She was
I
like
was
one of
not
the
doing any. I was
the
in the
only
single
people there.
digits in the
Yeah.
90s.
But she would check her email once a week, you guys. It would be an event, like she would get to the computer and it would be like a once a week thing. Yeah. Where were we?
Um, so I mean, uh, I mean, I always find you
if I'm
very.
مخضرمين, you're Saliq. That's Let's just
No,
agree
but the
to that.
Salik are older.
I know, but
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I mean. You're طائفة يعني.
Yes.
Yes. انتمائك.
Huh?
You're
Intimate.
oh,
Yeah, my
yeah.
affiliation.
Sunila's a rebel, yeah, and she belongs to the rebel poet group.
You are a rebel too. I mean, um, I remember, like your play was one of the first queer Arab artistic events that I first went to, and it was great to hear because you were talking about people that I had met personally.
Was this though in Beirut? You were there.
And in New York when you read She,
Okay.
He, Me,
Yes.
which I mean I think we should acknowledge, and we'll come to this, the
Mm.
question of writing in
Mm.
English and the whole issue, which I think is what I'd like to mostly talk about. Uh, but you know, I know Arabic poetry and fiction and much better than I know drama. So but you are one of the Arab playwrights that I know and I'm inspired by always. And like I also I find kind of kinship in you, not to be too identity politics, but as a gender fluid and a mixed origin person, I always find that we have so much to compare and whine about and cry. We're thinking of forming a conservative trans caucus
It's
recently,
true. It's true.
right?
We discovered recently that, like for example, we're very hyper conscious about wearing masks in the airplane and being early to the airport because, and I was trying to, we joke that we're gonna form a conservative caucus. Like as trans people, we can be more conservative in some
Socially
ways.
conservative.
Yeah, but it's
We
my.
go to bed before 3
It's
a.m.
true.
Don't take a lot of don't take drugs that much.
It's true.
Well, you're more. You don't drink.
I don't
you
drink
don't
coffee.
drink
even,
coffee, which is a red flag for me.
Trigger warning.
Trigger warning.
But I
Not
mean,
even decaf.
not even decaf. I mean, I justify this by saying I think we just can't take one more thing. I don't know if you agree with that explanation. Like that, why we're so conservative socially is just can't deal
Or
with.
I
On
don't
top
even
of
know if
being
I think it's
mixed,
anxious trans caucus.
anxious conservative.
Yesterday
trans
someone was saying that trans people are the most another trans was saying that trans people are the most anxious people that they know,
Really?
and yeah, and
anxious how like just
like
generally.
socially anxious and anxious around others. And I some people consider me a very awkward, socially awkward, no filter. We were just talking about how to talk in Arabic about boundaries, and then we were like,
I think
"Iqamat al-hudud," which means to enforce stoning on.
if it's true that trans people are more awkward or anxious
Mm.
socially, I think it's probably due to the fact that so many trans or non-binary people are on the spectrum. No, I mean that's what's become apparent lately,
What do you mean?
like autistic or
Oh,
ADHD
yeah.
or so.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe not. I think just the existence.
Besides the fact that cis people are killing us, I mean, could be
or
autism,
wanting to
or
cancel us.
yeah.
But I think that there's some way that our existence is. It's not necessarily. It's not necessarily. It's just inconvenient for the system, because male and female are still, even if you can change it on your papers, but there's a whole other set of institutions where you just run into it, and and then it's suddenly like, ugh, can't you just not be who you are?
Snap out of it.
Snap out of it. Decide. um, and then you start feeling like your existence is inconvenient. But I was more interested. I mean, as you know, as my senior, as they say in English, um, what um, what was it like being gender? I mean, how did you? I guess firstly, I don't necessarily want to talk about your gender journey, but your creative.
Mm.
How did you get interested in theater? I wanted to be an actor when I was a teenager, and then I
Yeah.
just kind of drifted away. I don't know.
I think it's genetic. I think like I wanted to be an actor when I was 6 years old, and that was, and I mentioned this in a new text that I'm writing. It's and we were living in Saudi Arabia at the time, where you have no theater. I mean, you have like, I don't know how I knew what an actor was even at first grade, and it's something that I wrote on, like, we had to write what we want to be when I grow up, and I wrote I want to be an actor. And then the principal came into the room to do a surprise inspection of the classroom, and she saw actor, and she made me erase it and write actress.
Oh,
And so I'm like, this was the first.
misgendering.
Yes, yes, very clear in
Yeah.
my mind. But yeah, I
I
really.
remember you gave an amazing presentation about your also in I think at NYU a few years ago with the PowerPoint and pictures and
Yes,
so on.
yes,
That was a great.
yes. So I theater started something, it was something very innate. I used to do puppet shows as a kid. I also discovered like home videos on the Super 8, it wasn't Super 8, Handycam that my father had.
Camcorder.
Yes,
Uh,
exactly. I discovered these old tapes recently at home, and I had made entire movies with my cousins and my siblings, and I called them plays. Like I would film a piece of paper at the end, play written by and directed by, and I consider them plays. So I really don't know where this comes from, but what I'm working on now is a text about theater and transness, theater and queerness, and I'm finding that historically these two things are very, very intertwined. So I suspect, if not some kind of reincarnation, some kind of genetic link between like my own gender
Well, you definitely
queerness.
have more social skills than I do if you can do it because I can't imagine having to work with so many people.
It's very, very challenging. Yeah. But you were saying that you wanted to talk about your use like Arabic language and transness and your translations. So tell us a bit about that.
What about?
I
I
don't know.
mean,
You were
I
saying
was
you wanted to talk.
interested. I guess we both had kind of colonial educations in English. My I don't know, the mother tongue of my dad's family is Urdu, and I didn't ever really learn that or Hindi after like third grade. Neither, and I learned French later, and there was no kind of even question in my mind about this. Although it's good to know, it's a good French is good to have.
What's the question that's not in your mind? I didn't
That
understand.
why didn't I want to sort of know my mother tongue better?
In Urdu, yani?
Yeah, until this was not. I mean, kind of Eurocentrism was just a kind of unquestioned thing. In I mean, in that sense, I was like everybody else, my age. Probably that was your I don't know. That was, and at some point that I had to kind of go to the heart of, I'm glad I got to go to like the heart of to realize that no, like you don't have to be Eurocentric, and Arabic was kind of a roundabout way to.
And what is Arabic for you? Like, what kind, is it a space of freedom and discovery? Like in relation to
I
all
think
of
it's a
those things.
space of discovery, and it's a space for me to uh, express myself and be connected to like my brownness or Asianness. And I don't mean when I say Asian, I mean it in the British sense. Asians, you know. Uh, without feeling like I'm being pigeonholed necessarily, because most people in the academia or just like study where if they're not white, if you're white, you can, be interested in whatever,
Exactly. Whatever you want.
or be a CIA accused of being, by, um, that's kind of the tough part for the whites, I think. I don't know. Anyway, but if you're brown or black, or then you have to like study yourself
Yeah.
or where you're from. But I still find it's quite rare that, I don't know, South uh, Arab person wants to do something related to South Asia, or South Asia wants to do related to um, although it's becoming more and more. So it was a way for me to, but I don't think I don't know, somehow I feel like it's not a coincidence that I ended up, instead of being an academic, a traditional academic, I wanted to be a translator. I feel like there's some, like, I don't know how it occurred to me to start doing translation as my like graduation project in university. I don't know why. Maybe I was already bored with writing papers or something. But I feel like there's some weird connection at a very sort of deep sort of I don't know, subliminal level with being trans and being a translator.
And being mixed
And being mixed
yeah,
also.
it's like it's part of
We
our
have to translate
all the time.
who we are all the time to all the, people out there who don't get it. And it's tiring being.
And you worked recently we were together in Oslo for an Arab arts festival, Saahat.
Yeah, queer.
Yeah, and we did a queer event, and you did some beautiful translations of Adrian Rich. And how was that for you?
That's something
Arabic,
I got
yeah.
interested in a few years ago with my partner. We decided to try to translate some erotic poetry by Marilyn Hacker, the American lesbian poet. And it was just kind of a question of hobby, and I still don't feel totally confident. Like, I need to show it to someone, but um, it somehow was nice to, pleasurable to translate these poems that have to do with, queerness or androgeneity, or actually the other piece that I read was this translation by an anonymous, was a poem by an anonymous Pakistani poet written in English, not in Urdu, where she has a sort of personal conversation with the Prophet Muhammad, and which is based around the story of his cat. And I hope that can be published
Where do you
somewhere.
see these translations possibly being published?
I mean, the Marilyn Hacker ones were published in Rusted Radishes, which is a magazine that comes out of the English department at AUB.
Yeah.
American University of Beirut. I don't know where the Muhammad one will be published. Maybe I can apply for asylum now at the end of this.
Online, live.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about a little bit about like you were asking me about theater. I lived in Beirut in the 90s. I studied in Beirut, and
So you were like you actually went somewhere else. You left your parents
yeah,
to study in
the
university.
only reason I was allowed to go to Beirut was because my sister was studying there. Otherwise, being a Jordanian girl in the 90s, it would have been very difficult to go anywhere. And even, my sister had gotten a scholarship to the US, and she wasn't allowed to go because she's a girl. So uh, Beirut was like the furthest you can get, and it was very, very far, even though it's close. But in the 90s, you didn't have like any kind. There was the only way you could call home was through a central. Like you couldn't even like from the dormitory. I couldn't call my parent. There was, and even the central, you couldn't get through most of the time. You'd have to wait half an hour, and suddenly they'll be like, "Oh, we got the line," and then you would have to run and get into the booth and speak. I wrote this poem about it once because
Oh,
it's so dramatic, and then you couldn't hear, and it was very expensive, so you had to be quick. So you were really isolated from them. But I was lucky to be exposed to.
my dad told me once in the 60s when he was a graduate student in the US that in order to call back to India, uh, the they had to reserve an appointment at the post office 3
It was
days in
like that.
advance.
Yes, absolutely. I identify with this. Even in like in the dorms itself or in a house itself. When I got to Beirut, it was just after the war, and you didn't even have lines within Lebanon to call. And if you could get through to somebody, it was like absolutely miraculous. You'd be like on the phone, like, "Is this really you? I can't believe it." And it would just be like you would have to try a long time to keep until you got through. So yeah, but I was saying because you were asking about my influences and doing theater is like I wasn't allowed to do theater as a girl because my father was very strict, and that's considered a place where, you know, girls stay up late at night and mix with boys, and it's a شيء غير محترم يعني, which
Not
not
respectful,
respectable,
respectable.
yeah, line of work, which in fact it isn't. And
My
I
grandmother wanted to be a singer
really, and
when
they didn't let
and
her.
was not
Of course. Yeah, my
because there's an old association between any kind
prostitution.
of professional performing and courtesanship.
Yeah, which is it's there. They were accurate. They were
I
completely
mean,
right.
yeah, that was the way that you because you had a patron
Yeah,
and if you had a patron, you're supposed to be sexually available to
of
them.
course. So, but in Beirut, so I didn't end up studying theater. The closest I could get to it was something called communications, and that was like media studies, and we had one or two theater courses in the program, which was amazing. I did very well in those.
And there was Masrah Beirut,
There was Masrah Beirut,
which
and
I've heard was
there was
a
it was
inspiration and like a fountain of.
and Masrah al Medina, and so this was like
I'm
for
sort of jealous of
you should
people who
be,
were
you
into
should be,
Beirut
you
in
should
the 90s.
absolutely be
It was
jealous.
a place where you could have genuine,
Absolutely.
unfiltered experiences.
And one of the experiences, like we had, what happened in Beirut in the 90s is it became a center for theater, like in the Arab world, in the sense that we had Tunisian companies coming, we had Egyptian companies coming, we had things in Beirut itself, like Nidal Ashar did the production of Saadallah Wannous, طقوس
How
الإشارات.
important was Sadallah Wannous for
He
you?
was like me seeing طقوس
The
الإشارات
famous
والتحولات.
Syrian
What's it?
playwright.
Signs of transformation. What's it
Yeah,
called?
rituals of
Rituals of
signs and
signs of
transformation.
transformation. And I saw that with Julia.
Qassar.
Julia Assar, and absolutely life-changing show, because here, like, um, here was he is not a queer person, but he wrote these two gay characters into the play, and we were just and it was his like his final his finale, yani, before he died of cancer. And he even came, and he, you know, he was every year for the World Day of Theater, you have somebody who gives who writes a speech, and he was chosen. I think it was 96 that he was chosen, and he came as he was dying of cancer. He came to Beirut, and he had this, I remember he was wearing this hat and a scarf, and he was very frail, and you could see he was unwell, and he put all his effort in, and he sat on the stage, and he gave this speech about for the World Day of Theater. And we saw his play also, and it was just, this man made such a huge impact, because as he was dying, he said, you know, fuck it, I'm gonna do what and he said what he wanted to about, you know, old Damascus and the way things were, and having like self-hating characters. Like, we could identify with this self-hatingness that we had, especially in the 90s. Like, you couldn't say that you were gay at all. I remember when my girlfriend broke up with me, my first girlfriend, because I was lesbian at the time, and I couldn't tell anybody in the dorms. I was living in an all-girl dorms, and I had even gotten in trouble at the dorms because they had seen me sitting on the lap of my friend. She wasn't even my girlfriend. That's another story. But somebody went and told the head of the dorms that, they're being lesbians in front of the dorms. And
I mean, the whole thing about Beirut being free is, is a
it's
thin is a thin
it's
veneer,
very thin. It's a very
and
thin
yet
veneer.
there is something about it, but it's not.
Yeah,
It's not
it's
what.
complicated.
Yeah, hashtag it's complicated.
Hashtag, it's very complicated. So
I
anyway,
never use hashtags in
I'm
actual,
glad that you didn't.
but I just say it.
Yeah. For yeah. So after this incident with the girl, I was called in to the head of the dorms, and they're like, "You're ruining the reputation of our dorms." And this is while like all the straight people are making out and practically having sex like on the trees by the dorms, but me putting my head on the lap of a girl was like ruining the whole reputation
Won't
of
even
the
lead
dorm.
to pregnancy.
مثلا.
Can't. Yeah.
So yeah, when my girlfriend broke up with me, I couldn't tell anybody. I could, and my roommate saw me. I was clearly very depressed, and she was like, "What's wrong?" And I had to say, "Oh, I failed my exam." I had to come up with a story that she could relate to and console me on the basis of. So and um, so seeing Saadallah Wannous there and reading, like knowing that this character existed in the play was really empowering to me as a self-hating queer person, because it's like self-loathing and is a very vital part of my own queerness, at least. I don't know about others, but yeah, just to go back to your question about my influences in theater. Yeah. So I ended up, going back to Beirut in the 2000, the aughts, as they call it. No, yeah, the aughts.
Is that the 2000 to 2010? Is the
Yeah,
odds?
is it?
Or is
But
it?
it was I went 2008, and I wrote. I ended up writing documentary plays about trans and queer people, Arab people. So, but
In
based on
Beirut,
in
right?
Beirut, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Which we got to read some of at the festival
yeah,
last week, and was
yeah.
super. And I knew I'd met one of them personally, and it was
Absolutely.
um
One of the because the people they're based on real people, so they're still there. But yeah, so and actually, when I was in the dorm, I had a book of lesbian poetry, and Adrian Rich was in it, so it was very special for me to hear you.
later apparently I found out she endorsed the transsexual empire, this
Oof, you
horrible
have to.
book.
ta-
And yet I will still read. I don't know. I feel like this whole issue of, what do you do when you find out that someone who's writing or music or anything, output that you love took a position that was really reprehensible. I feel like for everyone that there's a line that, like, I don't know, starting from Wagner being a Nazi or
True.
whatever to
I think
Adrian Rich being I feel like it was a fashion amongst lesbian
to hate
feminists.
trans people, it still
Yeah,
is, no.
it's still.
And that and what was I gonna say? I was talking to a friend
Is the
yesterday.
penis the enemy?
Is it?
I don't know.
But my friend says everyone disappoints, and I think that's a good
Yeah,
summary of.
we will probably
I'm
disappoint
sure
someone
we
at
have
some
already.
point.
I'm sure I have. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
شو كمان؟
shukran. I realized I was asked to write like a testimony of being a translator for this new anthology of essays about like, and I thought I could share something very short about like what I was talking about earlier, if that's okay. Um, is that okay?
Very, very okay.
Translation as unsettlement. Were I to offer a motivation as to why I became a translator, I would say I translate because I wish to avoid writing. The more optimistic motive, the affirming one I tell myself sometimes, is that I put the trance back into translation. In either case, I inhabit translation because my existence is itself unsettled. I come from an unsettled identity and have lived an unsettled life, both in the sense that I'm mixed and grew up without my mother, who had schizophrenia, but also in that I have never felt settled in either of the places I purportedly hail from, not where I was born, New York, nor New Delhi, where I was raised. It is perhaps no coincidence that between my liminal or mixed gender and my liminal or mixed origins, the fact is I have become a translator. My American mother was the daughter of Yiddish-speaking pogrom survivors. My father was born into a Urdu-speaking Kashmiri Hindu family that found itself on the wrong side of the border during the partition, an event which robbed him and succeeding generations of our ability of our family of the chance to learn to read our mother tongue properly. I translate because I am not stably anchored, neither in my origins nor in my cultural affiliations, my sense of belonging, or my gender. To translate for me is to experience being an outsider, a trespasser, a poser, and to be able to revel in that condition.
Rocket.
It's coming out later this
So
or
this is
next year.
something you wrote.
Yes.
Nice. And it's coming out in the States.
It's coming out in a new press called Trace Press, which is dedicated to decolonial translation, based in Toronto. And I think this is one of their first publications.
And you work a lot with Shadiaq also. Is there transness or queerness in Shadiaq's work that you can talk about?
Well, Shadiaq was this figure that people who don't, which is very unfairly not well known even by most people in Arabic literature, because he was from like the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, and in this period where there was, colonialism in the area, and this kind of what is called the Renaissance or the Nahda, but I don't really understand why. It was just basically the Arab world coming into what is quote unquote modernity, and the Arabic language sort of moving from what is the classical sort of old style to like what now is the style of writing or MSA or whatever. Um, so he has this novel which is like impossible, really difficult to read, um, and called Leg Over Leg, and it's loosely based on his own life, but he begins it by weirdly by listing, going into a tangent about how just the world wouldn't be, anything without women, and then lists 100 words, synonyms in Arabic for vagina. Thank you to Rana Isa for introducing me to that, and reading them out one by one. But also he says this weird thing, or his character, loose, sort of thinly fictionalized, says like, I just wish that God would have created me a woman, uh, uh, or if I could be reborn, I could be. And then there's some other scene where the main character, in when they're in England, because he lived in France and England and worked for British missionaries, uh, the main character decides one day he and his wife to cross dress. So his wife dresses up as a guy, he dresses up as a woman, and they go like flouncing around in the street
On their merry way.
on their merry way.
Wow.
So he's hard to place. He's not a, the nationalist or the anti would be sort of. he doesn't mind working with the English or the Americans, or he's kind of a pen for hire, but he is a very independent thinker, and who pushes the envelope. And it's sad that his vision of Arabic language, how it should be, was not the one that became the dominant
What
one.
was his vision? I don't know that much about him.
Again, I'm not the kind of the scholarly expert. There's a handful of other people that are more, but I think it's a less kind of Protestant influenced, conservative approach to, less Eurocentric approach to language, although he was a bit of a linguistic snob and disliked anything that was like common. I think he went in Paris to the theater and less to the Moulin Rouge. But yeah, I think he just loved to play with language.
Like you.
I love to, yeah. How are we doing on time?
How much time is left, sorry? 20 minutes?
Oh God.
عليهم.
Allah yustur. But what about you? And I mean, you, in the era that, it seemed kind of just an automatic choice that one has to switch to English if one wants to write about sexuality, or French maybe in some cases.
Yeah, if you're in Lebanon. It's but everything was like that back in the day. I mean, even I remember in Beirut, like the first we had rock bands in the 90s. We had an electronic music band later on in the late 90s, which was Soap Kills, and it was the normal progression of things was that everybody would sing in English, or I mean, Soap Kills eventually did Arabic lyrics, not English, which was a big deal. That was like the first time I heard that, I was like, wow, this is amazing. So I feel like it was a stepping stone. There was like the stepping stone to what we have now, and it's I guess a normal process of, I don't know, حداثة, modernity, maybe. I don't know what else to call it.
Reclaiming
yeah.
Because there's such a strong, I feel like Arab nationalism really fucked everyone over.
Say more.
Especially in terms of language, because there's this sacred approach to language and the purity of language that can, not be. And I'm not one of the people that likes to type in Arabizi or Arabic in the Latin letters with numbers, but even for the foreigners who are learning, or heritage students, there's so much this fear that is somehow even subconsciously of like making a mistake, or
I think also there's this
or
kind
not sounding eloquent, which this obsession with not making a mistake and not, I think, is very paralyzing for people. So a lot of them just are like, fuck it, and I'm not going to.
And I mean, in that same context, I think you have this idea, which I'm also researching and working on a lot lately, is that this is something not of our culture. And that's what we were told growing up, is like, this is something Western, whether it's feminism or queerness, or this was like the prevalent idea at the time.
What are you so what are you looking into?
Now I'm looking into the ways that transness and queerness were there, but a lot of things that came with colonialism, whether it's the laws or the idea that this is not of our culture, is so much there. And so what I'm looking into now is that no, it was there.
I mean, I know that, and this is known, that these anti-sodomy laws mostly sodomy, because for I think even for Queen I think in the case of India, Queen Victoria couldn't imagine that two women would do anything with each other. But yes, like they were put in place by the colonial authorities, but I don't think one can just stop there. I really hate this romantic sort of simplification of, oh, before the Europeans came, we were just amazing and perfect and genderqueer and non-binary and
I
loved
think
each
it was
other.
complicated, but what I grew up hearing was
Yeah.
exactly the opposite. That this was never in our culture. It was so. I'm just trying to
I mean, I feel
complicate
like
this
those
a
are
bit.
two extremes that kind of meet at some point.
Yeah.
And I'd love to know more about, what you're finding
I mean,
looking
I'm
into
looking a
this.
lot, not just in our region, but also in South America, in Central America, in among Native American cultures in North America, in African countries, in Asia, in Philippines, uh, in Taiwan, in Chinese culture, and what I'm finding are very
It's going to
significant.
be the
And Greece,
10-part genderqueer
yeah,
encyclopedia.
Greece especially. I mean, my research
Wow.
now is going. It started actually in Greece because I was actually. It happened by accident. I was looking at that Greek theater and plants because during the pandemic, I think all of us had a second career, and I was looking into plants. So I was looking into plant use as part of theater practice in
As
ancient
part of
Greece.
theater.
Yes, and then I started to discover an extreme like theater coming exclusively in ancient Greece from the worship of a transgender god, and as part of the practice of worshiping this god, and in no other
Which is because
context.
most of us, learning about the Greek pantheon of, we only know these hyper masculine
Absolutely, because
or
absolutely. There was a kind of I don't know what to call it, straight washing of or cis washing of Greek theater and Greek culture afterwards, like
I
this.
mean, in any case, the whole conception of Greek, Hellenic, or and culture is European as a post Renaissance or maybe even more
Yeah,
recent invention that
it's much more Egyptian than anything. What I discovered also is that
Egyptian, African, I mean,
absolute, which is African.
yeah,
I mean, so the Greeks learned so
and
much,
Mediterranean,
yeah,
yeah.
but mostly from Egypt. Their interactions in Egypt were very intense, and that's where, like, even this god was a version of an Egyptian god, and so it's Dionysus, and Dionysus is not very is considered an outsider, which is
Mm.
interesting as a person who's
He's the god of
trans.
like debauchery, right?
This is well, it's because
Or they,
it's
sorry.
yeah. Are you
Even
misgendering
we
me?
can misgender. We're all.
Yeah. So I mean, for example, I went into a toy store in Greece and Athens, and they had in the Lego section they had the Greek gods as like not Lego, but what's the other one?
Like,
Playmobil.
hmm?
Playmobil. And Dionysus was missing. Dionysus not even there, and Dionysus was the whole of Greek theater was for Dionysus, and it's one of the things they're so proud of. Greeks invented theater. First of all, note
As
that this.
reverence to
Yes,
Dionysus.
and Dionysus is not there, and even when you go to the Acropolis itself, you
Mm.
have the theater of Dionysus, and there's nobody there. Most people are up on top at the other temple, and I was even asking waiters around the restaurants, "Where's the theater of Dionysus?" They didn't know, and even when you get to the theater itself, all the information that's there is very sparse, and it's
Mm.
about, and they have pictures of playwrights from a time that was kind of like very cis, and from this cis washing of which is the new comedy they call it in Greek theater, and there was representations of them and nothing from before. So there's a lot of cis washing that happened to
Mm.
history, and that's mostly the focus of my work
I
now.
recently, I got into during COVID, got into Cavafy, the
Yes,
Greek
yes,
Egyptian
yeah.
poet, and I mean, just other than the fact that he lived in Alexandria, but also he has all these poems about Saida and Beirut
Okay.
and Sur, and which are uh, talking about like young, men cavorting with each other, whatever, in Greek, in these cities during the Greek, and it was just amazing to think, read these and think of them uh, between today and between,
Yeah.
you know, to read a poem today called "Young Men of Saida," but which is originally in
The
Greek and
accuracy.
taught, huh?
Laughing about the accuracy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we're definitely going back in time, and not in a good way. Like I definitely think the future already happened. I'd like to say, you know,
yeah, I don't.
and
Time
that's
is
what I
not
mean.
linear for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Um,
Especially for trans people. For trans people,
I
really,
think the
things were
Arabs
better
before
for us.
Islam realized that time is not
Ah,
linear.
say more.
Yeah, dahr. Uh,
Ah, interesting.
everything is that has happened will happen again.
Wow,
There's nothing new. There's
under the
nothing.
sun.
There's nothing new
Oof.
left to say. How are we on on top?
Yeah, yeah. Just to say, like for again, like like for trans people, like a lot of queer people don't even know that things were better for us before, or they think that we're living in an age of enlightenment now. And I was saying, I don't think it was perfect, but things have at certain parts
But
of history they
I'm
were
very
better.
um wary of romanticizing or idealizing
I'm not.
the past.
I'm not.
No.
No, no. I mean, I'm not. I really think, like, from what every time I read, I'm just like, we are really living in the dark ages when it comes to trans people's rights. Absolutely. Which again is not to say it's complicated, but when I read it, like it's mind blowing ancient Greece. Like, not, and I'm not just talking about, you know, pedestry and all the things that we know from classical scholars. That it was mind blowing, like huge. Yeah.
Same. Any
Like like
examples? Or?
when I talk about a festival, when the way that theater took place was in the context of a festival for Dionysus, I'm talking about a festival where the whole city had to participate, the whole city. So it wasn't optional. Everybody had to come and celebrate a trans god. Everybody had to, if had to cross dress. Like people who didn't change their gender appearance were frowned upon and mocked and were punished, like socially. Can you imagine? And this was a festival where thousands of people would come from everywhere, from all around the Mediterranean to gather. And this festival had several iterations around the Mediterranean in northern Africa, huge, giant like parade, like what we would think of as a pride parade, except with everybody participating, not just a small, you know, a small margin of society going to what we see now as a pride parade. No, everybody in the city had to be there, and they had huge floats in this parade, very phallic floats, very like so, and respectable dignitaries and politicians and their children would have to cross dress and, you know, change transgend. نعملها بفعل. فit was, and so now that's something we're getting killed. Trans people are getting killed, quite simply, and this wasn't something that happened in the past. Besides the fact that almost all the ancient gods that you see in pre-monotheistic cultures were transgender. All the people who were in the service of the gods or seen as having divine qualities or as having proximity to the gods were trans or gender non-conforming. So if you want to say you don't want to romanticize the past, I have to, because what I read is really devastating to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's because we don't learn any of this
No, we
about,
don't. And I do
yeah,
theater, and I didn't know all of this. So can you imagine?
or the story of Gilgamesh and all the
Enkidu.
Enkidu.
Enkidu. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the first the and Sidori, who was a sex worker basically.
Yeah, a lot of priestesses were trans women, and they had a very high status in society. And yeah, they weren't getting killed. They were getting worshipped. It's the opposite of getting killed, you know? So tell me about the progress we have now. I don't feel the same.
Yeah. Maybe is there questions for um, anyone online has or in the audience has questions?
Uh, because trans people and queer people were seen as being in between states, this kind of liminality was seen as a divine quality, and that could make you reach God easier, and that was everywhere. Like in the Philippines, for example, every culture you look at, it was because the gods themselves were seen as having masculine and feminine qualities and being, the whole cosmos together. People who embodied that on Earth were seen as having this godlike quality. Yeah. What's that? There you go. Maybe you can. I would love for you to come and talk. Yes.
They got killed and they were demonized. So it was, yeah, a lot of Filipinos don't know about this also, which a lot of queer organizations in the Philippines are trying to um, bring back our history um, by, yeah, putting it into our literatures in schools, for example.
Wonderful. And is there resistance to that from the school districts or the ministries, or
Yeah.
is there a battle happening?
Yes, there's a big battle because we are a very Catholic country, and a lot of our schools, especially private schools, are run by the Catholic schools. So, Catholic schools can decide which information they can put in the books, in the pensum. So, mostly these information are just online. And that's what's the beauty of now that kids, the youth, have more access to information about these information that they don't get in schools, because in schools it's very filtered. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erwin.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So
Oh,
you wanted in the example that you got.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So this was. So I do tend to romanticize.
No, I'm all for knowing. I mean, in the Indian context, there are, at least in the upper caste, Hindu tradition, there are gods with varying, with gender non-conforming aspects, but at the same time, it's still a very sort of tradition that's still like extremely like violent, like guilt glorifying war, you know, fighting or killing just because that's like your destiny or your what's like been ordained for you, and not even if there's like a reason for it. So I mean, the thing is that I think one has to learn about these things, but also like take it with, not with a pinch of salt, but you have to always like try to understand it within that context, and not with the lens of what's that? Oh, sorry. Got started. And not I think just like, yeah, uh with critical distance and appreciation at the same time. um
It's on Twitch. Where can
what
people?
is Twitch? I'm too
Oh
old to
yeah,
know.
Twitch is kind of like you play games together, and there's also a streaming platform.
Sorry.
But anyway, It's been great to hear about these topics. Where can people learn more about this stuff? That's the first question. Yeah, gods basically, and trans gods.
About trans gods. If you look into, I'm actually writing a book about this, but if you look into, there, there's quite, if you look into, there's an encyclopedia, I'm trying to remember the name of it. Actually, it's hard to find particular information about this unless you look into the specific culture that you want, for example, Aztec culture, or or like if you look into Aztec culture, for example, you will find that, or ancient Filipino culture, you will find that. It's you at the moment. I haven't found one particular book or resource, which is why I wanted to write it. Yeah, comprehensive, shamil book. So you would unfortunately have to do the specific culture that you wanted to find
Just, I
out
mean,
about.
I think there's so many to choose from that you can
Yeah.
choose, and then the like this
Or
conversation we start
yeah,
somewhere in the day.
Hawaii
Mm.
is a really good place to start. Um, Specifically indigenous cultures, you just scratch the surface and it's all gonna be there. Or to look into Dionysus, for example, look at a photo of, like, just look at a picture and like Google Dionysus and the images, and slowly
Or
you're gonna
close to
see.
here, I mean, in
Yeah,
Norse mythology, I believe
exactly,
Luca is
exactly.
supposed to be the mischievous, but also gender, like somewhat gender playful god.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate about their gender, but
Yeah,
I've heard different things about
yeah.
them. But what I was gonna say is, like, yeah, if you look in any of those pre-monotheistic, or even after, sometimes we existed, which is a thing that we didn't really have in modernity. We didn't really exist, and we still don't in many modern contexts. Whereas in ancient ones, we're always existing. It's like
And
it's
when we
so
say
affirming.
ancient, we mean like
Yeah.
like antiquity and
Or
before.
even, like, for example, in ancient Egypt, like the god of the flood of the Nile, like the whole of Egyptian culture relies on the flood of the Nile. The ancient, like the Egyptian genius and the birth of civilization happening in Egypt happened because Egypt had a flood. And the god of this flood is called Habi, and Habi is a transgender god. And nobody ever talks about that. But if you Google Habi, Habi has breasts, and Habi has also a male presentation at the same time. What does that tell you? My God, like the yes, yeah, or a trans man. I don't know. Maybe what? Where Habi? Really? I didn't know where. Ah. Yeah, I don't know if this is being heard on the video, but Alma is saying that that Habi, yeah, yeah, probably is probably in the British Museum, you guys,
Or in the Louvre or
in the
something.
Louvre,
Yeah,
Louvre Abu Dhabi.
yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, so get in touch with me because I'm writing a book and I will send you the book when it's finished, and you can find all of those resources there. Thank you
Mm.
so much.
Thank you.
Yalla.
It's also from Twitch. If you think this should be taught more about in schools, where and when do you think would be good to teach about these things? And or what do you most wish you had learnt about?
I think this is a question for young people. School, I'm 46, so the last time I was in school was a long time ago. But I mean, at least in history classes and literature classes, like you have ancient Sumerian literature by trans women who were priestesses. Gilgamesh, Sunila was saying, is like a gay love story, basically. It's a good question. Where else it could
I mean,
fit?
I think as early as start as early as possible. Um, you know, as
Indoctrinate them
early,
as early.
indoctrinate them, spread the gender ideology as early and quickly as you can through, you know, devious things like teaching
But
ancient.
also in religion, like in ancient Judaism, you had 6 genders, I believe, 6. Like, and I grew up as a Christian. Never was I taught was there 6 genders in the Old Testament. My God, you know. So religion, history, where else could it? Literature. Where else? PE, like
PE.
like not have in gymnastics and physical education, like not having trans people be worried in the bathroom when they have to change among cisgender people. You know, those are the small worries and concerns that happen at school. I'm trying to think where else. Philosophy, yes, absolutely.
I think as much as possible to not be like, you know, teach this as trans stuff. It should be part of,
Yeah, or
it
like
should be part of
or
history,
queer stuff like
or queer.
Alan Turing, you know, stopping World War II. Like how often are we taught that in history?
And
Or
he was forced to get
yeah,
hormone therapy because he was
or
found out.
or Oscar Wilde, like us being taught Oscar Wilde's play while never learning about how much he was tortured for being a gay,
For being
yeah,
bi,
queer,
or
yeah,
yeah, and being a dandy.
yeah, or Virginia Woolf, you know. So everywhere, n- it's not gonna be easy. Like Erwin was saying, in the Philippines, there's definitely a backlash happening already, and I'm worried about that. So,
But I
with the
think there's some hope almost in the ferocity of the backlash, because it means that the sort of the
we're
system is
successful.
scared and is being shaken. And
Yeah.
I don't think, not that I believe in incremental, but I think that every sort of word and every you know, little thing that we do contributes. I don't know who is listening to this right now, but I'm sure that somebody listening has, you know, learned something that they didn't know before, and I certainly have learned stuff that I didn't know before. So, alayhum,
عليهم يا عرب.
onward.
Onwards and upwards.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, hello, hello. It's good.
Is this on? Yeah. So welcome, both to the people in the room and to the people online. It's really nice to have this space with you. My name is Viola. I use pronouns they, them. And maybe you can just introduce yourself a little bit.
Yeah, my name is Runa Kongsvik, and I use pronouns her and she. I work as a clinical psychologist, a lot with youth, but also adults with who are trans or with gender incongruence or different ways of performing gender.
In my background, I work at Skeiverden in Oslo, part-time, and I'm also an autonomous activist, I'd say, which basically means doing lots of grassroots organizing, community building projects, and much focus on movement building. So gathering like masses of people and putting much of the power structures that we have to the communities that experience being marginalized. And I work as a facilitator, movement facilitator, which kind of goes back into that work. Yeah. And what we will talk about tonight is like the main kind of themes are community building, mental health, and maybe kind of the intersections of those two. And before we go into the deeper questions that we had a little bit pre and warm up to this conversation, I'd really like to hear about what you're doing in regards to the project we were talking about, and start up from there, if that works.
Sure.
Perfect.
We were supposed to be a bit more people.
Yeah, yes.
More than two. So
Yes.
maybe we just have to interview each other a little bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Get into that curiosity vibe.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the project that I was discussing with you beforehand is a group intervention for youth. And it became an interesting discussion between us because you started asking about professionalizing community. But the project began because Bergen kommune, Bergen municipality, saw that there was a need for something for kids with gender incongruence or gender creative kids. And of course we know from research that there is higher rates, for example, of depression and anxiety. If you look at the research, you see that there are higher instances of these issues, and that's why the municipality wanted to create something specifically for that group. And feelings of being marginalized and alone can lead to these mental health issues. So it's very logic that having the opposite of that, having a community, can create better health. So I was asked to just start something that could bring that. And as we discussed also, I'm a psychologist, but I didn't want it to be therapy for trans kids with Runa. Yeah. I wanted it to be an open group for conversation, and I didn't want to limit it to trans kids. So therefore the name of the project is Samtalegruppe om kjønnsidentitet, or a conversation talking group about gender identity. And the hope was that people would feel like there was a space for them, even if they were early in their process or later, they were sure or they were not so sure, and they didn't have to have specifically those issues of anxiety or depression or other issues for that matter. And we have shared about the group online and contacted schools and other health professionals, but we haven't really gone out in the media or made a campaign to recruit members. But even so, in quite a small city as Bergen, we have had now, I think, 9 rounds with 10 participants in each that have sort of heard about it through the grapevine or through someone at their school or something. And they keep on contacting us. So the need is quite big to have something like this.
Yeah. And that's kind of, when we talk about needs within a community, the way that I work in regards to these subjects, because often in the trainings that I do or the facilitation that I do, it's very much trauma-informed, so understanding how trauma acts out or manifests in a room or in collaboration, in organizing, and how to work with conflicts, what is a conflict, all of these things that make, because what happens in organizing, and when I say organizing, it can mean so much. It can basically mean showing up and being part of the community. So often when I hold these, I call it trainings or facilitation, but to train the participants to have the tools to work with it within the different micro communities that they're in, yeah? So when we were talking about this, like professionalism, I don't want to say versus, because it creates this polarity, because I do acknowledge that we need both. But in these talks that you're having, or these group processes, how do you think, I'm trying not to use the word empower, because that also has sometimes a negative feeling, because giving power to someone doesn't always work that way. But how do you think they are, how are these tools being embodied by the participants? Do you understand that question?
Maybe. Let's see.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Let me try. I mean, this is a question in itself. Do you need a psychologist to run a group like that? Because we can't assume that everyone needs a psychologist specifically to be there. Now I'm actually, my co-therapist in the group is Isak Bradley. That's a lot of people here in Trans Awareness Week knows. And that has been a very big addition to the group, to have someone who is trans themselves in the group. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be a mental health professional who runs the group. But two things are important, I think, or the way that I see it. The first one is that there is so much information out there, and maybe especially for two groups, for younger teens and for parents. It's really a jungle, and it's so difficult to find correct information or the right information. So that is a need for some of the kids to come and hear what is the situation when it comes to healthcare, for example, told in an objective way. And then the other thing is that, I mean, we have Trans Awareness Week, we have a Trans Cafe, which is like a meeting place every other week where you can just show up. And those things are community run and very important meeting places. I think for youth or those who participate in the group, it can be important that there is someone who is having a professional responsibility of them, but also a responsibility for moderating the conversation in a way, or to include everyone. Because it's so difficult for some to show up to something where it's just come and grab a coffee and hang out. For a person like that, it can be easier to have a clear expectation of, okay, we're sitting around the table, we're going to discuss such and such. Maybe someone will ask me my opinion. Yeah. So to have a lot and to have good knowledge of the field or the subject matter, but also to have this responsibility to include and to moderate.
I'm diving hard into something called liberatory harm reduction. It comes from harm reduction, which is basically strategies, and it's often been used with people who use drugs. So how to, and it's often been put in a public health system, so institutionalized, meaning that, say you do use drugs, and to get help, you have to promise to be abstinent, so not use drugs, and you go into this program. That's the kind of old school harm reduction, and then you have a liberatory harm reduction, which is it's safety strategies that originates from within the community itself and is run by the community. And I'm still trying to understand how this shows up in society in Norwegian context. And I'm really, really interested in trying to build safety strategies within the trans community. How can we take better care of each other? Because we also talked a little bit about, like, my activism comes from climate activism, so I'm very much in tune with the condition of our earth and all of that, and understanding how politically things will change dramatically, and when things change dramatically, who will be taking care of us? Which institutions will be take care of us? When we're already in this world not being seen or heard. So it's like I'm trying to really explore these connections. Yeah, just wanted to share that a little bit, and wondering how, like, you as a professional, because you work, it sounds like you work like directly with participants, like, who are going through mental health issues, and I think we all are always, like, I mean, generational trauma, and yeah, just living is traumatic itself. But, like, could you see yourself ever holding a training in how to kind of, like, do some sort of education, like share some of your education to the community so that we can take some of the tools and develop them ourselves? Or have you thought of ever doing something like that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, of course I would do that. And I do that sometimes in the form of, for example, talking about how to cope with crisis or how to cope with trauma. And we talked a bit earlier about after the terrorist attack, the horrible shooting that we had in June, that to feel down, to feel shaken to your core, to feel angry, to feel desperate is a completely normal reaction.
Yeah.
Whether you were there or you just feel like it happened to your community. And then we are really depending on each other. We really need that human connection and human support. It can be very useful to know something about what is a normal reaction. When to seek professional help, because maybe not that many people actually even need it, but they need the community help, and they need just the basic knowledge that maybe you don't have to worry if you're crying for 3 weeks, because that is within what is normal. So yes, I think that is important knowledge to have. But I don't think psychologists own that knowledge. I think a lot of it is common sense and caring for one another. So yes, I have done that in the past, but and I would always say yes to do something like that. But I don't think all the answers can be found in the psychology textbook.
No, definitely not. While you was talking, I was going back to this, why some of this subject is actually and has become very professionalized. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Which subject?
This, like, on mental health, or even mental health techniques, or emotional like how to emotionally regulate yourself. All of these things, like, yes, we can definitely go on, like, online and check them out, but this, like, collective care isn't so much talked about anymore. Often it's like this individual way of dealing with your problems. You go into like therapy and you talk about yourself and whatever you carry, but it never is taken like more broader into like the collectiveness of like the collectivity, the being part of something bigger, even being part of society and all the systems within that. So yeah, why, or not why, I don't really like why questions, even though I often do go back to them.
And why do you think that is?
Because it's like, the more whys you say, the deeper to the root you kind of get.
Okay, but I understand a bit more now. It's a good question. I think the awareness around mental health, of course, it's huge compared to 5 years ago, and definitely 15 years ago or 50 years ago, and you have completely different streams of information now, and you know, mostly you could say it's a good thing, but usually in these type of campaigns you find this advice: talk to someone, see a professional. And yes, of course, that is a good advice for a lot of people who might really need that. I also often meet people who say everyone should have their own psychologist. So in the same sense that you all have a fastläge, a family doctor, because we're all supposed to have that in Norway. And I don't agree. I don't think that is necessarily a good solution or use of a resource. I think what we are forgetting many times is that mental health is something that goes up and down, and it's very human to feel despair and difficult feelings. But also, what builds a good health can be the very basic things. Of course, diet and sleep and fresh air and all of that, but this sense of belonging, sense of community is so central. So if we advise people to go and talk to someone who is a professional, by their role, they are detached from the community, and are supposed to be detached from the community of that person. Yes, it can be part of a solution, but it can't really be the whole solution. So that's maybe what I'm missing a bit in these campaigns or in this discourse or conversation about that.
Yeah, and you chose to do gruppesamtale. How is that in English? Group conversation? Group therapy. Yeah.
Well, no, not therapy.
No, why? See, no, okay, this is not therapy. Why is this not therapy?
Yeah, that's also a difficult question of definition, but I didn't want to create an expectation within the kids that they come and they enter into this therapeutic world.
Okay.
I want their expectation to come in being, I'm going to be part of a community.
Yeah.
And that is the difference for me. I mean, some of them might still have that feeling that this is group therapy, but I called it a conversation on purpose, and that was for that reason. And that's it. I mean, when you look at this minority stress research and you see how being marginalized or being detached can lead directly and indirectly to physical and mental unhealth, then it just makes sense to have a community. Then I think the group can help each other achieve something which is different than what I can do one-on-one as a therapist.
Yeah, so basically taking from each other's number one experiences, knowledge, maybe even, because it seems like often when people show up in community or in like a group, there's so much knowledge within each of us, and when I'm thinking like these group conversations open up to maybe share some of that knowledge even.
Yeah, and I think not just about sharing knowledge, that is very important too, but this sense of sort of we are together here, we are creating something new or something different. There is like a running joke in the group that I'm the minority there because I'm the only cis person. Because both of my colleagues, Isak and another colleagues, are trans, and then all the kids in the group are also trans. So then I'm like the odd one out, you know. But to them, it's a sense of they are always the minority wherever they go, whether it's at school or if they do a sport or they're at the mall. They are always in a minority. And then suddenly there is this different community where they feel like they are a majority. And that is just a very new feeling for many of them, because they're quite young. They haven't really entered into any queer community. They belong to many communities with their hobbies in school, but to have something where they feel as part of the majority is new to them.
Yeah. Like when we're talking about community and community support and care, basically, I'm starting to think about how, especially in maybe this is Norwegian culture, Norwegian also not just culture but politics. Like we're in a capitalist, neoliberalist society where the individual is the main character. Also the way like Norwegian culture, how we relate to family is different than from my culture, for example, which is Albanian. And so community care can look different from each, like from country to country. And like being here, I've often like noticed how, just like when we talk about family dynamics, yes, I can have like as a trans queer person, I have my dynamic with my family based on that. But regardless of it, how I've been brought up is to understand family in its wider sense as well, and also being in this community. The chosen family is something also. So like how the concept of family has, first of all, from my upbringing, is already wide, and then being queer has even gotten even wider, and that has made me be like, okay, how can I show up for all of these people that I've chosen to have in my life? What does even community mean? Is community only where we just show up on an event like this and we have the same identities? Is that community? Do you actually care enough about me that when my life and where my mental health is at its worst that you will show up? Like, how can we build deeper, like fully deeper relationships with each other so that we can actually sustain each other more? My political organizing is radical. It comes from, like, it's radical in Norwegian context. I'm an abolitionist, so that means that I don't want the police, for example. I don't believe that police give us safety. Never has, never will. It's built on a violent, and it is a violent institution. That said, how does a world without police look like? Angela Davis, I believe, has asked that question several times, which has gotten me into this, okay, how do we keep each other safe? What does it mean to actually keep each other safe? How do we build deep relationships? I don't know fully where I'm going with this. It started with community, but it is within this even mental health practitioner. Like, yes, you're choosing group conversation as your format to build belonging, and hopefully once people have belonging, they have a want and desire to show up for each other, so that you don't have to again do it yourself. Like it kind of replicates. It's like a pebble in the water, and you kind of see the beautiful rings, and it just like goes and goes. So yeah, I guess my question goes back to community. What is it? And how are you seeing, you talked about this group going a little bit on their own. Yeah.
That was that went for quite a spin.
Yeah, my brain goes on many spins.
Yeah, if I can just share some thoughts about that
please.
first. Yeah. I think something which is just very fascinating about being Norwegian and hearing other realities is that you become acutely aware of what a privilege it is, for example, to grow up in a community where you have such a high trust to the state.
Yeah. Yeah.
because that is something very unique to Norway. This is something we saw during the pandemic, that we really trusted our government, and when they told us to wear masks, we did, and when they told us to wash our hands, we did. But then when they told us we couldn't go to the cabin, then we got really pissed.
For those of you who have cabins.
Yeah, I wasn't personally affected. But for example, when it comes to protection by the police, I mean, last year, the hate crime, the law prohibiting hate crime came to include hate crime towards trans people. And that was new. Before it was only sexual orientation.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is something that the queer community, and of course specifically the trans community, has fought for a long time, to have protection under this law.
Yeah.
So that motivation to have that in the law in itself speaks to your trust, I would say.
Yeah.
Because why is it important to have this law if you don't have any trust in the system that upholds the law? So, I mean, we have a way to go, of course, when it comes to harassment and discrimination. I just wanted to say that it is kind of a privilege to be fighting that fight within sort of a framework where you expect someone to look after you and to protect you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always happen. There, of course, are examples of people not receiving that protection. But in general, we have a reason to expect something and to claim something, and that in itself is a privilege.
Yeah, because what I'm seeing more of, like, looking at the grassroots. So when I say grassroots, I mean organizing outside of NGOs. And in Norway, it's heavily NGO-based, which means that you're often an NGO who gets funding from the state somehow. And that puts some sort of kind of, I guess, limits to what you can do, or how radical you can be, or they put the agenda somehow, which is kind of the deal, and that's fine. We need both. What I'm seeing in the grassroots, we see more mutual aid projects, which is basically the community funding itself and giving back to the community. So Comrades Inc. Is one who do this splice funding for the trans community. They share it, they do events, and they gather the money, and then they distribute it personally to each individual. That's one, and I'm hoping that we see more of this also within the mental health, or I don't know if we can call it mental health, maybe like, what would you call it? Psychology, kind of like more in the support care, trauma informed spaces. I hope to see more of that. Yeah.
Are you talking about raising money for?
That's just one. I mean, another is basically like another mutual aid kind of project is. This is not based in Norway. It's based in the U.S. in the Bronx, New York. It's called the Friendly Fridge. It's basically a fridge in the middle of the street that people organize around, and the food that is put in that fridge is never. It's not. There's no big company that gives away their access food. It is the local community. It's very, very local that does it. Like even your neighbor can put their dinner from yesterday and put it there, and then so like these kinds of projects. We saw so many of mutual aid projects happening during COVID in Norway. And mutual aid projects happen often in crises. But it is a way to sustain ourselves outside of institutions. And I guess I'm very pro that. While also like having, I mean, you can have these, I mean, we do have these institutions, and they will always most likely coexist. But it is such a powerful thing seeing the community deciding themselves what is important for us, what are our needs. Is like and that's like when I'm thinking, I like that our reference is this group conversation, just so you know, because it helps me kind of bring me back. But it is like going back to that, seeing when you just, I heard you say you're moderating the conversation more, like, is it the same dynamic that when you have in that group as in when you have individual conversations, or what space are you, like, what is your role in that group? Like, how do you go in and out of that role? Because I'm interested in seeing what are you allowing the participants to do? Because once they know, like, I can imagine that once they get that space, it does something and it shifts something in them, and they bring it also into their just everyday life. Yeah. Because you, I mean, as a therapist, or as a, what can I call you? A psychologist? Yeah. As a psychologist, you have it is a power dynamic within that room, and it's like, how are you navigating that, and how are you giving power, or maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I want it to be as free as possible. I don't want to come in as an expert and tell youth what they care about. They should tell each other what they care about. So especially in the beginning, it's a lot about creating a space that is safe for them to say anything, really. Because it's not easy for them to just take the word. So we do icebreakers and we do exercises, and usually we have some form of structured round where everyone says something. And then I usually say explicitly that if you don't want to say something, then you can just shrug, and then we'll just move on to the next person. So it's kind of shifting between that and having a more open conversation, but sometimes they're just quiet. Maybe the topic is difficult. Maybe they just pick up on each other being quiet, so then they themselves find it safer to be quiet. So it's a lot about creating a bit of a fun and light atmosphere, because I think for them it's kind of they're put a bit to the spot when they are sitting like this. But that being said, it comes easier and easier for them. So we meet 6 times over the course of 3 months, and after the first or second meeting, they are usually carrying the conversation more, and they can bring topics more, and yeah.
And how would you say, because I started thinking about trust, how important element trust is, not just in this group, but also in the entire conversation that we've talked about, community care and support is based off of trusting each other. How would you say is a way to build trust? This can be general speaking, or you can use this space as an example, but what have you seen build trust, and what can trust do to us?
I think building trust and building relationships is kind of the same thing. It's about meeting many times and seeing that someone keeps showing up. So I think in general, having these meeting places is important, because then you get to have physical experiences together, whether it's in this group or whether it's in a queer bar or in a festival. Or so when you see that same person showing up, you get to know them better, but you also know what they stand for. Or having a conversation, having a discussion, and maybe not agreeing on everything, but being able to share how you feel and stand for it. That is also something that builds trust in yourself and in someone else.
And how, like, say, because now I'm often I'm going back to organizing a little bit, but because that's also about building trust, trusting that we are comrades, which means that even though we disagree, we want the same thing. And I hear you talking about, or I hear like building relationship. And then the question that I have was, I always want to be specific about my words, so sometimes I use some time to find them. I'm not getting it. Yeah. How does, like, because they can share whatever they want, and we are in a diverse group. How would you work with conflict in a group like that? And I'm asking also because it's something I can learn from in all of the groups that I'm in, and this goes just so I kind of have you on my train of thought. It goes back to community care and support, because we are in conflict all the time, and we do harm all the time. We are harm doers, and we are kind of someone who is experiencing harm all the time. It is the kind of like that, and we don't talk enough about that dynamic. So I'm wondering how can we lean into conflict in a more generative way, where conflict is actually a positive thing?
Yeah, I just somehow thought about what you said about NGOs earlier, and although I think so many things are very positive, and how we are very privileged to have a lot of public funding for maybe people who are originally grassroots to start something and to start their own NGO and to get money and to get trust that they do what is best for their group, it can also lead to conflicts within the community. If we think about the queer community, and I have my group that I'm fighting for, and then you're fighting for your group, but we're fighting about the same money, or not just money, but power. So you know, I think generally it can be a problem, whether we're talking about the queer movement or the feminist movement or left-wing politics, that we can be split up. But yeah, that's kind of a bigger picture.
But that's a consequence of not understanding conflict and how to deal with it sometimes, I feel.
Yeah, and how harmful it can be to the project that you yourself have or want to further. Especially in Norway, it's a really small country, so it's especially maybe problematic. I mean, I don't know. I feel like when I meet these young people in this way, it's such a cliche, but I get really a hope for the next generation.
Yeah, same.
Because they have never said anything hurtful to each other. And mind you, it's been now 9 rounds times 6. What is 9? Thank you, 54. So we've had 54 meetings with 90 kids. So there should have been some some conflict. I don't know. Maybe they are better at taking other people's perspective than kids their age, because they have gone through this process.
Yeah.
Or maybe there is another reason, I don't know. But there has never been a conflict.
No.
We've had other issues that have come up. Maybe someone is talking about something that is difficult for others to hear, or...
Yeah, but that's actually maybe something, that kind of dynamic I'm interested in. That to me is maybe not a conflict per se in the way that we are not like agreeing, but it is you harming someone indirectly without knowing, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is maybe the good thing then about having someone moderating the conversation, as it were, that I can take that role and say, well, how does that feel for others to hear, and maybe suggest that it's okay to leave the group if it's something that is too difficult to hear, or but when it happens in a different space that is unmoderated, then maybe situations can play out differently. But of course, it can be tough to hear something about abuse, for example.
Yeah.
If you personally have been exposed to that, or maybe you have never been exposed to that, then it can also be very overwhelming to understand that that is something that can happen to other people. So occasionally it comes up, but I think it's possible to have good conversation about how to have that conversation in a group setting.
Yeah.
Without limiting yourself, but at the same time kind of taking other people into account.
Yeah. Sorry, just need some water. It's as a facilitator, that's something I often miss, I guess. When we go into groups, we forget that it's an art sometimes to be in groups, even though it's something we've done just as humans in general. But understanding who takes care of who in a situation when if something ever occurs, like, yeah, I do somebody harm by saying something that is insensitive, or assuming that nobody in the group are sex workers, for example, and then talking about that group in a way. So kind of these things that come up again and again and again, but yet we don't really talk. We never mention it. We don't say when we go into group, how do we want to be today? Like, who do we want to be in this room together? Like doing these check-ins. And I guess that's how I relate to your work. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a therapist, but as a facilitator, it's my role to moderate and to clarify whenever a misunderstanding happens so that it doesn't perpetuate violence in a way. Yeah. How are we on time? What does that mean? Okay. Do we have any questions from the people in the room or in the chat yet? I think so. There's a...
It was very interesting, this talk about NGOs, and you said that you work in Schijvarden.
Yeah.
Do you think that the work of NGOs that is funded by the government, that is stopping some activism that could happen in the community, but because we only wait we are angry and then we want to organize our anger to have an action, but then we wait for the fund to come to do this action. Do you think this kind of funding is stopping a lot of activism that could happen in the community?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I just need to specify a little bit that I'm having two hats on right now. So the Schijvarden and my more radical autonomous grassroots hat. And the benefits of NGOs is how they're good at building community and safer spaces, especially with Schijvarden. Many of our members aren't visible, so to have a space where you can feel seen for all of those identities is super important. And I don't think necessarily that in a capitalist society, it would have been amazing if like, to be honest, if we could organize these kinds of spaces outside of the NGO. But it's like, again, we have to, be mindful of living in this society and also doing activist work. So that's kind of where, for me, NGOs come in. To answer your questions regarding if it inhibits us from being more radical, because that's kind of what I heard you say, or doing more action-based stuff. For me, that's radical. I definitely think so. So during Reclaim Pride, like now the shooting and the Reclaim Pride having the role that they had, what grassroots does so well is to be adaptive in a society that's changing like this. So whenever a momentum comes, if the movement is based off not within the NGOs but outside of it, we can be so much more adaptable to the constant changes that we see. And I think we would also see more, maybe even civil disobedience in cases where we need it, like stuff like that. And using more of the democratic tools that we have available.
Is it something that you discuss within the organization, that, for example, okay, we have this project, and then we will give a deadline to the government to give us funding on this. If they don't give us funding, so then we will run it by ourselves, for example?
I don't know, actually. I don't take this into, I don't, because I see us having the need for both. So I don't see why we should always be funded by the state in all of our projects. It is like I'm saying, being funded by the communities is extremely powerful. It lets us set the agenda a little bit ourselves, and to provide needs for ourselves. But politically speaking, NGOs are doing so much important stuff. Like when it comes to survival, I want to say tactics that we need now. So the laws, yeah, getting gender expression, or yeah, into what they used to call rasisme paragrafen, or they call it, but it has a wider kind of, yeah, than that. That's important. We need that change here now so that we can survive. But in the long run, I'd like us to think even more, kind of reimagine ourselves in this world where we don't need these things. And to imagine, always imagine, always imagine. Yeah.
I have a question.
We also have one here first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'll give the mic. It's a question on Twitch. Is there any advice for decentralized grassroots? That is, when the population that wants to support each other who are geographically far apart. And I can just add, like, Norway is a very long country. Most of the grassroots that we have, or the NGOs, are based in the bigger cities. I think I'm just going to assume, and I think I know, that if you live up in the north in the country, or you're queer or you're trans, you basically are alone. So how can we
connect more?
Yeah.
That's also something that I'm still trying to navigate a lot. I guess this is where online comes into play, but also not even like what I've seen, or why I keep asking myself often is, what does my local, what does my neighborhood need? Like, even ask that. It doesn't have to be about my rights as a trans person, as a queer person. This is where kind of my idea of being of service to my community is very based off of the people around me and the needs that I see. So, like, I guess grassroots for me is organizing within your local neighborhood and be like, what does this neighborhood mean? Because once we, like, it wasn't Harvey Milk who, when he was going to become or getting votes, he started focusing on dog shit in San Francisco. That's how he got lots of votes, and that's something many people cared about. But that's what I'm trying to say by taking that example is, how do we build relationship with each other? How do you build relationship to your neighbors? What can I do to help my neighbors who can then help me back? Mutual, that interdependentness, that what's the word? Reciprocity, like reciprocal way of being with each other. Yeah. So I don't have a specific answer to that question. I think it's something we have to keep exploring. But I guess I'm trying to challenge a little bit, what does it mean to be grassroots, or what does it mean to be in organizing? It doesn't have to be political in the way that we think. It doesn't have to be this institutional, we're going to go and lobby or change laws or whatever. It can be, I'm going to put up a freaking fridge here, and I'm going to fill it with food from my neighbors, and I'm going to give it to my trans siblings, and then see what happens. Yeah.
I guess. Okay, thank you so much for this conversation, first of all. It's definitely very thought-provoking for me. So there were like a couple questions and also thoughts that I wanted to bring up. First of all, we keep speaking about community, and sometimes we're really confused about what we actually mean by speaking about that, because how many people are community? Is it like 3? Is it 4? Is it 2? What exactly do we speak about? What kind of relationship formats do we refer to? Exactly also what you were mentioning about like really deep connection. How can we build that? And one of the things that I always think about is that comes with deep emotional understanding as well, and therefore a potential to speak about these emotions. And maybe that is where my question goes a little bit to the both of you when it comes to creating community, for example, and mental health, and then also taking into account that not all participants of communities, for example, are always capable of being in community at all times. What is the role of mental health, like an emotional language, and maybe specifically as well rage, which I don't know, came up, I wrote it down here at some point in the conversation, when it comes to building communities? And like, how do you deal around that? And how can you develop a language that also kind of challenges a little bit this social normative perspective that we have on emotions, also taking into considerations that emotions is something which is usually completely like taken out of certain societies, and then others not so much. But maybe within the Norwegian context, my perspective is that like speaking about the emotions in community is like something that comes with a long build of trust. So I'm wondering, like, what is there, like, your experience, or also when it comes to building community and like managing a little bit these levels of, yeah, like jumping over the gap to building like really deep connections. And like, I'm getting lost in my question, but maybe you know what I mean.
Yeah. Is 2 people a community? Maybe. Maybe it's a very exclusive community. A community, because I mean, it has a little bit of a different meaning in English than in Norwegian, maybe. So I guess a community can be the area of the city that you live in, or it can be your group of friends, or one friend. I was recently in a course where they talked about cityscaping, city planning, and how it impacts mental health. And they did some studies, for example, if someone lived on this type of street where you have to drive, or on this type of street where you can walk to people quite often, they actually rated their mental health as better. So the conclusion from that study, but also from other studies, is that to build a good mental health, we have to have connection, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an extremely deep connection. And that was interesting for me, because when you are feeling lonely or feeling in need of connection, you are automatically thinking about a romantic relationship, maybe with a partner, or having these friends that you have been through everything with, or maybe a parent or another family member. But actually it turns out that if you just talk to the same person on the street, or maybe you go to an activity, you sing in the same choir every week. So you have these interactions that are maybe more shallow, but they still have a massive impact on your mental health. So that was something, and of course, yes, you can feel lonely in either situation, whether you have 2 really close friends or you have 100 acquaintances, or you can feel not lonely in either one. So I think it's many ways to build community. Personally, when I moved to this city 5 years ago, I was very happy to be part of a minority community, to be part of the LGBT community, because there was physical meeting places and activities and just a community to be ready to be absorbed in. So in that sense, it was certainly a strength or something good to be different. So now it's happening that I'm getting lost in the answer to the one who got lost in her question.
I think what I'm wondering about is which is a little bit maybe also linked to something that I'm thinking about a lot lately, which is empathy, which for me also has a lot to do with how we interact. And I feel like there is a little bit this limitation to how we're allowed to show up in societies, which then can be very restrictive, because there's different forms on how we show up, and then that kind of generates different social interactions or have different like social performative modes, which then as well, especially being queer, often is like an element, right? So I'm wondering about how can we stretch, or in community building, what can we do in order to also like stretch this way of how we can show up in societies and still find community without being kind of socially restricted from it. And I think in that case, I was wondering about rage, because I feel like especially when it comes to grassroots organizing and political work and any kind of activism, I think rage is a very important emotion that kind of keeps popping up. And
it moves us very
It
quickly.
moves us, exactly, but that at the same time keeps being kind of held back, because I still haven't really figured out how to express rage publicly in a safe way that does not harm people. If you have a way of suggesting that, I would be very happy to figure that out here.
But that's also...
But yeah, how to include that into community building and also mental health, because I think those both are also very linked.
Because what I wrote here was like, I think the way I interpreted your questions or your exploring, ways of exploring, how do like emotion play, like how does emotion play into organizing? What space do they have in organizing? And immediately started thinking, okay, why do we organize? What makes us like do action, like that's being moved emotionally? Everything we do is from an emotional state. Like when I did civil disobedience for the climate, it was because I was so moved, angry, sad. Also this feeling of justice, that just like I have to do this now. But I see your point in like we also live in a Western world where the logic is I am, I think, therefore I am, is in the kind of the whole basis of Western thought almost, and taking away the emotions from our being, and I do wish we had more space to express our emotions in organizing or in community. I don't think we have the tools on how to deal with it. That goes back to, again, how can conflict be generative? How can conflict be a positive thing? If I am angry and you are sad, am I angry about the same thing? Are you sad about the same thing? Like, what is our mutual kind of connection? And to understand the way or our emotional language expresses itself in different way because of culture. Again, like Albanian, like we are mad as crazy. Like we can get angry. Actually, like at home, I would have people, like my Norwegian friends, come and be like, "Why are you arguing?" Like we're just talking. and then like I'm seeing people, like some of them laugh. Like this is a very widespread thing, except for the more like European Nordic countries. So again, like what culture do we bring into it? This is why I love diversity in it. Yeah, we have some time here. But actually, I just want to really go into one thing. What is community? Just to kind of give a little bit on that. I think it's a conversation we should have more. Only because I think it's a word we throw out, and we think we are in a community and we care. That's not the case. Within transformative justice, which is a framework that I miss having in Norway, it's very, very present in the US, is pods. Pods is a new word, and I think it comes from the Bay Area. There's a BIPOC-led trans organization that does this and has made a tool called pods. And that's it's called pod mapping. So within your community, you have people you call in case you are hurt or in case you perpetuate violence. And these pods, like the people you put in your pods, often what because they have a website where they talk about people maybe had one in their pod, maybe even nothing, and yet thought that they were in community. So they saw this kind of conflict, but paradox. So I miss having more of these kind of tools within our movements. Yeah, just to kind of give a little bit on that.
I just have one more question, and I think we're running out of time, but I hope you can answer. How do you support each other's mental health in grassroots movements when you meet resistance or adversity? And I think both of you should answer.
Okay.
In a professional way as well, Rune, but you've also been an activist as well.
Oh, now it all comes out.
You lead for Bergen Pride. You lead. You organize, panel discussions that are important to the queer community as well.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. You just put me off a bit there, but okay. Yes. How do we support each other? So, for example, in Pride, I mean, I don't think we should glorify this community either, because I think that the queer community or the LGBT movement or Pride movement is a very open movement, and it is spacious. People are usually accepted and allowed to join, but it's not the same necessarily as having someone in your pod or having someone close to you that will have your back or will support you if you're going through something. So maybe there can be a bit of a expectation of that happening, maybe, if you move to a city and you join a community, so you feel like, okay, finally, I will have my people. But there is still chemistry or no chemistry, or, there are all sorts of things that go into who do we decide to really get close with. So I think friends and close relations are usually the ones that you turn to when something happens to you personally. But I also know that NGOs, sorry, but that they do fill a really important role here.
Yeah.
When it comes to, after the shooting, for example, just having a physical place to gather, or to have someone who is seen as a leader or someone in the community that don't have a position as being a mental health professional, but is someone that you can go to and address because they are, for example, a leader or someone who has a position in that community. So I think those things are important. And lastly, I think and I hope that that maybe we are a little bit better in the queer community at sort of being inclusive and caring about how other people feel. But I know that we are not at the stage where that comes naturally for everyone to do towards each other.
I think that strength comes from chosen family, this concept of chosen family, of choosing to be in the community because it's something you need to survive. Just to kind of add to that last one. Yeah. I think we're rounded up there. Thank you so much for being in conversation with me.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining in.